Okay, so when you think about, big, dramatic stories from history or scripture, the Battle of Jericho, it's right up there. It's instantly recognizable. You picture the Israelites marching, totally silent, for 7 days straight. Then the trumpets blare, this massive shout goes up, and boom, those huge, thick walls just crumble. It's always been presented as this, like, ultimate story of a miracle, divine judgment, holy war, even.
Absolutely. That image is incredibly powerful, isn't it? The miraculous destruction, the unquestioning obedience. But that traditional picture, well, it might actually hide a deeper, maybe even more challenging message in the text itself. The material we've dug into for this deep dive offers a really radical counter-narrative, almost revolutionary, you could say.
The counter narrative, how so?
It completely reframes what might have happened at Jericho. It suggests the real weapon. It wasn't some supernatural sonic blast, or a miracle purely designed for destruction. Instead, the really disruptive force, the thing that brought the change, was the powerful, visible example of a totally new way of living, a different kind of society.
Wow. Okay, that's a huge shift in perspective. So we're moving away from sheer divine power or military might
Right.
and towards something more like system change, driven by social contrast and internal collapse.
Precisely. That's exactly what we're diving into today. We're going to unpack this interpretation, and we'll be focusing on these key ideas, showing evangelism, this concept of internal collapse, and also figuring out the ultimate goal here, which our sources call the OU, the contract community. And finally, we really have to look at the danger, the very real contemporary danger of sticking to a simplistic literal reading of these complex ancient stories. According to these sources, Jericho is maybe less about conquest and more about, well, social revolution.
Okay, let's start right at the beginning of the action then. The 7-day march around the city. Traditionally, like you said, that's seen as just pure obedience. You march because God told you to, end of story, even if it looks crazy.
But this newer interpretation sees that week-long procession completely differently. It wasn't passive obedience. It was an active demonstration, a profound, deliberate almost, psychological operation. The source uses this term, "ue."
Which means...
It translates pretty directly as showing evangelism. Think of it like
So.
theater. But theater designed specifically to undermine the existing order inside those walls.
Huh. Showing evangelism. So what were they showing? I mean, the people inside Jericho weren't blind. They could see this procession every single day.
Exactly. They were showing off the radical, unique features of their own community, the Israelite community. Try to imagine it from the perspective of someone inside Jericho. Maybe someone poor, someone oppressed, standing up on that wall watching. They'd see a group. Well, unlike any army or society they'd ever known. What's missing?
Okay, well, no obvious king, right? No fancy nobles riding around demanding things.
No ruling class, exactly. No visible kings. No aristocrats dripping with wealth taken from others. There was no institutionalized slavery. No rigid hierarchy where everyone knew their place, usually at the bottom.
So they were showing equality, like functional equality.
A practical commitment to fundamental social equality. Minimal difference in status or wealth. They were living proof, walking around the city walls, that a different way was actually possible.
And that contrast, that must have been jarring compared to life inside Jericho.
Absolutely critical. We need to understand what Jericho was. It wasn't just any city. It was a classic example of a rigid, top-down, oppressive pyramid structure. It wasn't a sustainable society built on fairness. It was fundamentally a system based on plunder and exploitation. A tiny elite at the top. Exploiting a massive majority underneath them.
How massive? Like, what kind of numbers are we talking about for that division?
The sources we looked at estimate that the oppressed group, the Ochoa, made up something like 95% of the total population inside Jericho.
95%.
95%. Think about that. Almost everyone in that city was likely suffering economically, socially, to maintain the lifestyle, the power, the security of the tiny 5% elite, those huge walls. Yeah, they kept enemies out, but maybe just as importantly, they kept the oppressed majority in line and in fear.
That completely flips the script on the idea of defending the city. You imagine everyone united, but actually 95% of the people maybe felt they had very little stake in defending that particular system?
Precisely. They had little to lose and potentially everything to gain if that system just collapsed. So picture the scene again. For 7 days straight, this huge majority, probably dealing with debt, maybe forced labor to keep the fortress running for the elite. They're watching this radically different society just walk peacefully outside their wall.
The psychological impact, I mean, for the elite, it must have been unnerving.
Unnerving for the elite, sure, but potentially transformative for the oppressed majority. That march wasn't just a one-off event. It was sustained, repetitive. That repetition gives time for doubt, for questions to really take root. Day one, maybe they dismiss them. Look at those weirdos marching. But by day 7, after seeing this alternative model day after day,
They'd start asking questions.
deep questions.
Hmm.
Is it really possible to live without kings, without this constant oppression? Maybe. Maybe this other way, this contract community they represent, maybe it's actually real.
So the marching wasn't just marching. It was like holding up a mirror to the injustice inside Jericho.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It wasn't passive. It actively planted seeds of yearning for something better. It raised subversive questions about their own reality. It was a visual lesson in freedom.
And that constant pressure, that visual contrast, it builds up.
It builds towards what the source calls a critical threshold. So that point where the psychological weight of seeing a possible alternative, seeing potential freedom, finally outweighs the fear of the current oppressors. That's the moment when real internal subversion can happen.
Okay, which brings us right to the climax. The walls falling down. Everyone knows that part. If it wasn't a divine sonic boom, if it wasn't that classic miracle, how did those enormous physical walls actually fall? This feels like the point where the interpretation gets really challenging.
It is. It's the linchpin of the whole argument, really. The source proposes this concept of shadow internal collapse. The argument is this, that week-long, relentless exposure to the possibility of a non-oppressive life pushed the desire for change among the oppressed masses past that critical threshold. Hope finally became stronger than fear.
So the famous shout, the big climax, it wasn't about sound waves breaking stone.
Not primarily, no. It was symbolic. It was a declaration. The shout was the collective voice, the symbolic, unified, maybe even spontaneous cry of the oppressed people saying, "Enough! We refuse to live under this predatory system anymore." It marked the moment of system subversion, an internal revolt, a collective decision to basically overthrow the 5% elite. That broke the city's spirit, its political structure, before a single stone physically moved.
Meaning the oppressive system, which only functioned because the 95% complied out of fear.
Right.
It just evaporated. The foundation crumbled from within.
Precisely. And here's where the military angle gets really interesting, even paradoxical. Think about the soldiers on the walls, the defenders. Most of those soldiers wouldn't have been part of the 5% elite. They would have come from the 95% majority. They were likely working-class guys, maybe conscripts.
Okay, but hold on. Military discipline is incredibly powerful. Wouldn't their training, their loyalty to commanders, the immediate threat of the Israelites outside, wouldn't that override any class solidarity?
That's the standard assumption, absolutely. But the source challenges us to think about which threat felt more real, more immediate, and more destructive to their own lives. The Israelites, they'd marched peacefully for 7 days. They hadn't attacked. They'd only shown something different. But the internal system, the oppression, that was their daily reality. The source poses this critical question. If you're a soldier from the 95% standing on that wall and you hear that massive unified shout rising up from the city behind you, a declaration of freedom from people just like you, who do you point your weapon at?
The enemy isn't necessarily the people outside the walls anymore.
It becomes an internal security crisis for the elite. The soldiers face a choice: defend the tiny minority who exploit them, or join the overwhelming majority who represent their only chance at a decent life, the life promised by the contract community. In that moment, the source suggests, many would turn their weapons inward.
Against the commanders, against the elite, against the system itself.
Against the very power structure they were forced to protect. So the fall of Jericho, in this interpretation, wasn't primarily an external conquest. It was the existing oppressive darkness, that system, losing its foundation, losing its power, and collapsing inward when faced with the light of a new social possibility. The possibility offered by the contract community. The moment the oppressed saw a viable alternative, the whole rotten structure just dissolved. It was systemic failure, driven by hope, not by divine destruction.
That's a profoundly different way to understand victory. It's not about one group beating another. It's about eliminating an unjust system.
It absolutely elevates the whole conflict. The source is very critical of the traditional view that boils it down to, us versus them, who wins, who loses, based on who God likes better. That's just standard human warfare, predatory warfare.
So what does this interpretation mean by a God-level war, then? What's the difference?
A conflict at this level, according to the source, aims much higher than just defeating an enemy or taking land. It aims to eradicate the root cause of war itself. And the source is clear. That root cause is the system of plunder, oppression, and exploitation. Those systems inevitably breed violence.
So the real enemy wasn't the people of Jericho, it was the system of Jericho, the way it was structured politically and economically.
Exactly. The ultimate goal isn't conquest. It's establishing a new, sustainable social order, one based on justice, equality, and fundamentally breaking that endless cycle of violence and taking spoils. That's the whole point of the contract community. It's essentially the blueprint for a society where resources are shared fairly, exploitation is forbidden, and hierarchy is minimized.
Understanding that goal establishing the contract community is really key, isn't it? Especially when we get to the hardest part of the traditional story, the command to destroy everything.
Hmm.
If the divine nature is fundamentally about life and building things up, how does this interpretation handle that command without making God seem, well, genocidal?
Yeah, this is where the source is absolutely uncompromising. Reading that command, literally, as an order for indiscriminate slaughter, is seen as a fundamental distortion. It twists the divine into something destructive, something anti-life. It simply cannot be interpreted as a command for genocide.
Okay, but the language in the text is pretty brutal. If it's not literal destruction of everyone, what is it symbolizing?
The destruction is symbolic, specifically of the inevitable fate of the ruling elite, the 5%. Their entire existence was built on oppressing the majority. They were the ones who would have violently resisted any change, who would have clung desperately to the old, unjust system. Their destruction symbolizes the complete termination, the absolute dismantling of the old order's ideology and its power structures.
So are you saying the source implies that the actual removal of the elite might have been carried out by the rebelling 95% inside Jericho as part of their own liberation?
It strongly suggests that possibility, yes. It argues that the system itself was cursed, and those who embodied that system and refused to change had to be removed for the new, just order, the contract community, to actually take root. The focus is on destroying the structure of injustice, not on destroying life itself. You have to remember, Jericho's system was already life-denying for 95% of its people. For them, destroying that system was actually a life-giving act.
And this focus on the system, not just the people, is really underlined by how they handled the spoils of war, right? Usually, conquering armies grab everything, goods, animals, people, which just fuels the same old cycle of plunder.
But the Israelite action here was radically different. It was an anti-plunder statement. And Jericho, being the very first city they encountered in Canaan, made what they did there incredibly symbolic. It was like their mission statement enacted. They were commanded to burn or destroy the livestock, the common goods. That's completely counterintuitive for an army on the move.
Yeah, why burn useful things like animals and food? That seems like shooting yourself in the foot.
It was a political and spiritual declaration. By destroying the spoils, they sent a clear message to everyone watching in Canaan. Look, we're not like the other raiding armies. We're not here to get rich. We're not here to continue the cycle of predatory war. We're here to establish something totally different, the contract community. If they had taken the spoils like everyone else, they would have immediately just become the next oppressive elite, right? Replacing Jericho's system with their own version of plunder.
That one act, wow, it set them apart instantly from every other invading force back then. It defined their whole movement as something other than conquest, as transformation.
Absolutely. Their actions were defined by the contract, not by profit or plunder. And even the valuable stuff, the non-burnable things like gold and silver, were handled differently. They weren't divided up among the soldiers or given to a leader. They were collected into God's treasury. What does that mean? They became community assets, public funds for collective use. It underscored that wealth belongs to the community, not to individuals hoarding power.
It's probably important to stress, again, like the source does, that this super radical act, burning the spoils, was likely the big symbolic statement at the first city, the opening move. It probably wasn't repeated exactly the same way everywhere else.
No, probably not identically. But it set the ideological standard. It laid down the core values of the contract community. Justice comes before acquisition. Equality trumps hierarchy. It was the benchmark for everything that followed.
Okay, let's loop back one more time to the physical stuff. If the collapse was internal systemic, not a miracle sound wave, what happened to the actual stones, those massive walls? They didn't just vanish.
Right, we have to shift from miracle back to practical reality here. The source acknowledges other possibilities, like maybe a convenient earthquake happened, but it finds that less convincing, partly because it doesn't quite fit the deeper ideological message. Why would divine action be just random geology? The preferred interpretation, the one that fits the systemic argument, relies on this idea of obsolescence. And then voluntary demolition.
Obsolescence. How does a giant stone wall become obsolete?
Well, why did the walls exist in the first place? They were there to defend the predatory elite, right, against rivals outside, but also, crucially, against revolt from within. Those walls were symbols and necessities for a way of life based on plunder, fear, and control. But once you successfully establish the contract community, a society based on fairness, cooperation, sharing, where exploitation is gone, what happens to the need for a giant, expensive fortress to protect the elite from their own people and neighbors?
It disappears. The function is gone.
The function vanishes. The moment the system of injustice is dismantled, the massive physical apparatus built to defend that injustice becomes pointless. They become huge, useless monuments to the very oppression they just overthrew.
Wow, just piles of rock.
Exactly. And the source speculates that the people themselves, the newly liberated citizens of this contract community, looked at those giant, now useless stones and didn't see defenses anymore. They saw building materials, incredibly valuable building materials. So they likely dismantled the walls themselves voluntarily, stone by stone over time, hauled them away to build their own new homes, secure homes in a just society. The walls were recycled by the community to build their new lives.
So instead of one big instant miracle, you have this gradual, community-driven, practical act of transformation, taking down the old to build the new.
It's a powerful metaphor, isn't it? And understanding this gives us a completely new lens for interpreting Joshua's famous curse about rebuilding Jericho. Traditionally, people read that as a literal ban on ever stacking stones on that particular spot of land again, like it's cursed to ground forever.
But the source suggests the real warning wasn't about architecture. It was much deeper.
Much, much deeper. The rebuilding curse wasn't about masonry. It was a solemn, severe warning against systemic regression. It was a curse directed squarely at the idea of reestablishing the old, oppressive, plundering system, the very system that required those massive defensive walls in the first place.
So rebuilding the physical wall was just a symbol of going back to the old, destructive way of life, failing to uphold the contract community.
Precisely. It was synonymous with embracing injustice again. If you find yourself needing to build those kinds of walls again, it means you failed. It means exploitation has crept back in, inequality has returned, and now you need fortifications again to keep the oppressed majority under control and protect your ill-gotten gains from outsiders. The curse is on returning to oppression, not on the literal bricks. The divine command is fundamentally a mandate for sustained justice.
This whole reinterpretation, shifting from divine wrath and miracles to social justice, internal revolution, systemic change, it's honestly one of the most profound shifts in reading a historical text I think I've ever come across. Now, let's take this lens and really pivot to why this matters now. The source issues a really strong warning, doesn't it, about the dangers of literal interpretation today.
Yes, this is perhaps the most critical takeaway for us. The source uses very stark language. It says that reading the Jericho story literally as a divine command for destruction, for genocide, has historically been used as a terrible tool. A tool to justify conquest, atrocity, violence, all committed in the name of God.
And unfortunately, history gives us plenty of examples. The Crusades, justifications for colonialism, the oppression or elimination of indigenous peoples, often twisting text like this for validation.
Exactly. That literal misreading fundamentally distorts the divine nature. It turns it into something tribal, partisan, focused on destruction, picking winners and losers. It gives religious cover to actions that are fundamentally anti-humanitarian, anti-life.
But the source stresses this isn't just a historical problem, is it? The danger of clinging to flawed systems, maybe justified by misreadings, is amplified today in our interconnected world.
That's right. The threat is amplified because the systems of plunder and exploitation aren't just within one city's walls anymore. They're global. And the source explicitly links this failure of interpretation, this clinging to greedy, destructive ways of thinking, perhaps backed by faulty theology, to our current complex global crises.
Okay, connect those dots for us. How does the fall of ancient Jericho relate to something like the climate crisis or massive economic inequality today?
Well, think about Jericho's collapse in this interpretation. It happened because the elite insisted on maintaining a greedy, extractive system. They hoarded wealth. They exploited labor. They refused to share justly. That system was fundamentally unsustainable. It destroyed itself from within. Now look at our global system today. Driven by, often, uncontrolled development, relentless competition for resources, unsustainable consumption. Isn't it creating the same kind of internal stress? The same potential for collapse?
So the argument is that things like environmental destruction, climate change, they aren't God sending plagues or punishments.
Not at all, according to this view. They are the inevitable results of a human-designed system that is fundamentally greedy and unsustainable. It's a system bringing judgment upon itself, systemic self-destruction. Just like Jericho's walls ultimately fell because the social foundation was rotten with injustice. If our global system is built on endless growth at any cost, on exploiting both people and the planet, eventually it has to buckle. It consumes its own foundation.
That's a sobering analogy. Our modern global economy, with its inequalities and extraction, could be like Jericho's walls, essentially programmed to self-destruct if we don't change the underlying system.
It's a powerful call for critical reflection. The source argues that true faith isn't blind obedience. It's not just do what you're told, no matter the consequences.
Instead, true faith requires actively trying to understand the purpose behind the commands, which, in this interpretation, is always about building that more just, equitable, peaceful contract community.
Yes. And it demands constant self-reflection from us. We have to ask, is the God I believe in one who demands submission through raw power and destruction, or one who invites us, challenges us, to participate actively in changing the fundamental systems towards peace and justice for everyone? This interpretation shifts the Israelites from being just passive marchers watching a miracle to being active agents working with the divine to bring the contract community into reality. The danger of literalism today is that we keep focusing on surface-level rules or rituals while ignoring the deep systemic roots of injustice and unsustainability that are causing our biggest problems.
That really is the challenge this deep dive leaves us wrestling with. It forces a reevaluation of history, scripture, and our own actions today.
So just to wrap up the core shift here, Jericho, in this view, becomes a case study in successful system subversion, driven by the power of a better alternative. Holy war gets redefined not as conquest, but as the struggle to end the root causes of violence, the systems of plunder and exploitation. And holy living isn't just about personal piety. It's defined by the concrete reality of the contract community, built on justice, equality, and shared well-being.
And that brings it right back to you, listening now. If true holiness, that Hebrew idea of niash, isn't some mystical feeling, but the tangible reality of a community free from oppression, free from discrimination, free from exploitation, then what does showing holiness, that showing evangelism, look like for us in our world right now?
That's the ongoing call of the contract community, isn't it? It pushes us to look critically at the invisible walls standing firm in our own societies. Are they outdated political systems? Are they deep-seated biases, prejudices? Are they the economic structures that benefit a few while harming the many, or the planet? Just like the people inside Jericho saw the possibility of something better outside their walls, we have to ask, which of our walls need dismantling? And how do we collaborate, inspired by this vision of justice, to actually take them down? That, according to this interpretation, is the active, critical, even revolutionary role of faith in our modern world.